TSA Agent Marcus Henley had been with the Transportation Security Administration for 7 years when he made a decision that would destroy his career and cost the Department of Homeland Security $15 million in settlement damages. He was 38 years old, experienced enough to recognize federal credentials, but apparently convinced that his authority to stop and search travelers was absolute and beyond question. One Thursday morning at Reagan National Airport, he saw a well-dressed black man in business attire approaching the security checkpoint and decided, based on nothing more than appearance, that this passenger required additional scrutiny. The passenger was Secretary Raymond Lawson, the highest-ranking official in the department that employed Henley, returning from a confidential intelligence briefing. What Henley did next, ignoring federal credentials, fabricating reasonable suspicion, and publicly humiliating a cabinet member, would become a textbook example of how racial profiling destroys careers and exposes systemic failures in the agencies sworn to protect national security. A black man in his mid-50s, Secretary Raymond Lawson, was walking through Reagan National Airport's Terminal B security checkpoint at 6:38 a.m. on a Thursday morning. His Department of Homeland Security credentials were in his suit jacket pocket. His boarding pass for the 7:45 a.m. flight to Chicago was in his hand. No weapon, no contraband, no suspicious behavior. Just a federal official heading to his gate after an overnight briefing at the Pentagon. But TSA Agent Marcus Henley saw him through a filter so distorted by assumptions about who looks suspicious that he couldn't process a black man in an expensive suit as a legitimate traveler with authority. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Reagan National Airport sits less than 4 miles from downtown Washington, D.C., across the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia. Terminal B serves primarily domestic flights, and on weekday mornings it's packed with business travelers, government officials, military personnel, and contractors heading to meetings across the country. The security checkpoint at Terminal B is efficient, professional, and handles thousands of passengers daily. TSA agents scan boarding passes, check IDs, and run bags through X-ray machines in a practiced rhythm developed over years of routine. It was 6:38 a.m. on a Thursday in September. The morning rush was building. Business travelers in suits moved through the checkpoint with practiced efficiency. Laptops out, shoes off, belts removed. The air smelled like coffee and jet fuel. CNN played on overhead monitors. Fluorescent lights cast everything in that familiar airport glow. Gate agents were announcing boarding calls. The announcement board clicked and refreshed departure times. This was the kind of morning where thousands of people passed through security without incident. The kind of routine Thursday where TSA agents checked credentials, travelers caught flights, and the system functioned exactly as designed. Nothing dramatic typically happens in airport security at 6:38 a.m. on a Thursday. Secretary Raymond Lawson had been the United States Secretary of Homeland Security for 3 years. 3 years overseeing an agency with 260,000 employees, a $60 billion annual budget, and responsibility for everything from airport security to border protection to cybersecurity to disaster response. He'd spent 12 years before that as the director of the FBI, where he'd rebuilt public trust after a series of scandals, modernized the Bureau's approach to counterterrorism, and implemented reforms that became national models. Before the FBI, he'd served 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, trying cases involving organized crime, public corruption, and terrorism financing. He'd prosecuted mob bosses, corrupt politicians, and international arms dealers. His conviction rate was 94%. Lawson had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University, with degrees in political science and criminal justice. Then Harvard Law School, where he'd been an editor of the Harvard Law Review and graduated in the top 5% of his class. He'd clerked for a Supreme Court justice, worked on landmark civil rights cases, and published influential research on constitutional law and executive authority. He'd testified before Congress 47 times on topics ranging from counterterrorism to cybersecurity to immigration policy. He'd received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service, and the FBI Director's Medal for Excellence in Law Enforcement. His colleagues in law enforcement called him brilliant. His staff at Homeland Security called him demanding but fair. Foreign intelligence partners called him one of the most effective security officials in American history. Presidents from both parties had sought his counsel. At 56 years old, Raymond Lawson was exactly where decades of work had positioned him. Trusted with protecting the entire nation, respected across intelligence communities worldwide, and carrying responsibility that required both strategic thinking and unshakable composure. That Thursday morning, Lawson had spent the previous 14 hours at the Pentagon in a classified briefing about emerging cybersecurity threats to critical infrastructure. The meeting had run until 4:30 a.m. He'd caught 2 hours of sleep in a Pentagon conference room, then been driven to Reagan National for a 7:45 a.m. flight to Chicago for a noon conference on border security policy. He'd arrived at the airport at 6:30 a.m., already exhausted, but focused on reaching his gate with enough time to review his speech notes. He wore a charcoal gray suit, white dress shirt, burgundy tie, and black leather dress shoes. His Homeland Security credentials, a badge and ID card identifying him as the Secretary, were in his inside jacket pocket. He carried a leather briefcase containing classified documents in a locked compartment. He looked like what he was, a senior government official traveling for work. He'd done nothing to attract attention. He'd checked in at the airline counter, proceeded to security, and joined the line with dozens of other business travelers. His posture was professional. His expression was neutral. He'd spoken to no one except the airline agent who checked his bag. But to one person at that security checkpoint, Raymond Lawson's presence was a problem, and that person had decided to do something about it. Marcus Henley was 38 years old. He'd been a TSA agent at Reagan National for 7 years, hired after a brief career in private security that had ended when he was let go for what his supervisor called excessive aggression during routine interactions with customers. He was thorough, hypervigilant, and deeply convinced that his instincts for identifying suspicious travelers were superior to protocol and training. His supervisors described him in evaluations as results-oriented, but sometimes lacking in customer service skills and cultural sensitivity. What those evaluations didn't say directly was that Marcus Henley had a pattern, a documented years-long pattern of selecting black and brown travelers for additional screening at rates far exceeding statistical probability. Internal TSA reviews had flagged his selection patterns 3 separate times over 7 years. His random screenings were 73% non-white passengers, despite non-white travelers making up only 38% of Reagan National's passenger base. The disparity was statistically impossible to explain as random chance. 3 specific incidents stood out. In 2019, Henley had detained a black businessman for 35 minutes, insisting his laptop showed signs of tampering despite 3 supervisors finding nothing wrong. The passenger missed his flight. He complained. The complaint was filed and forgotten. In 2021, Henley had pulled aside a Middle Eastern family, including 2 children under age 8, for extensive questioning about their travel plans. The father was a surgeon at Johns Hopkins. They were traveling to a medical conference. Henley had insisted their documentation looked suspicious. Another complaint filed. Another supervisor review that ended with retraining. In 2023, Henley had stopped a black woman in her 60s, demanding she remove her head wrap for additional screening despite no policy requiring it. When she refused, Henley called for backup and threatened to prevent her from flying. The woman was a retired federal judge. The incident made local news. TSA issued an apology. Henley received his 3rd round of bias awareness training. Each time, the pattern was identical. Henley selected a non-white traveler. Henley found something suspicious about their appearance, documents, or behavior. Henley insisted on additional screening. The traveler complained. The complaint was documented, reviewed, and resolved with training Henley attended but never internalized. The system kept detailed records of each incident. The system flagged the pattern. The system recommended progressive discipline. But the system did nothing to remove Marcus Henley from passenger contact, because the complaints never quite crossed the threshold that would require termination. Each incident, examined individually, could be explained as overzealousness. Only when viewed together did the pattern become undeniable. Marcus Henley saw non-white travelers as threats and treated them accordingly. And on this Thursday morning, 7 years into his career and 3 bias training sessions later, Marcus Henley was working the screening line at Terminal B when Secretary Raymond Lawson approached. Henley watched Lawson join the security line. He noticed the expensive suit, the confident posture, the leather briefcase. And he noticed Lawson was black. In Henley's mind, shaped by years of unchecked bias, something didn't add up. Black men in expensive suits at 6:30 a.m. on Thursday mornings didn't fit his mental profile of business travelers at Reagan National. This passenger looked wrong. Too well-dressed, too confident, too comfortable in a space where Henley unconsciously believed black people didn't belong in positions of authority or affluence. Henley decided Lawson needed additional screening. Random selection, he'd call it. Just following protocol. Just doing his job. Do you think TSA agents should face automatic termination after 3 sustained complaints of racial profiling? Drop your answer below. Lawson reached the podium where Henley was checking boarding passes and IDs. He handed over both documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who flies constantly. Henley examined the boarding pass. Chicago O'Hare, 7:45 a.m., departure, first class. He looked at the ID. It was a federal government credential, Department of Homeland Security, with Lawson's photo, name, and title clearly visible. Sir, step aside. Random screening. Lawson looked up, slightly surprised, but not alarmed. Random screenings happened. I'm running late for a flight. Can we make this quick? Henley gestured toward the additional screening area. Empty your pockets. Remove your shoes. I need to see your boarding pass. Lawson complied, placing his phone, wallet, and keys in a bin. He removed his shoes. He handed over his boarding pass again. Of course. Here's my boarding pass and ID. Henley took the ID and examined it more closely. Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Raymond Lawson. The credential was clearly authentic, with security features, official seals, and proper formatting. This was Lawson's boss, the man who ran the entire department, the man whose signature was on TSA policy memos. But Marcus Henley, shaped by 7 years of unchecked bias and convinced his instincts were infallible, looked at that ID and decided it had to be fake. Because in his worldview, black men didn't hold positions like Secretary of Homeland Security. They certainly didn't travel through Reagan National at 6:30 a.m. in expensive suits. This ID looks suspicious. Step over here. Other passengers were now watching. A businessman in line behind Lawson glanced over. A woman collecting her belongings from the X-ray machine paused. Lawson's expression shifted slightly. Still calm, but now alert. He'd dealt with enough law enforcement to recognize what was happening. That's a federal government ID. I'm the Secretary of Homeland Security. This is where bias becomes impenetrable. This is where assumptions transform into accusations. Because Marcus Henley didn't just doubt the credentials. He actively refused to believe them, even when the evidence was literally in his hands. I don't care if you're the president. You're getting screened. Henley called over his supervisor, a TSA agent named Patricia Vance, 19 years with the agency. Vance approached, saw Lawson, saw Henley holding the credentials, and immediately recognized the situation was wrong. What's the issue, Marcus? Henley held up the ID. This passenger presented suspicious credentials. I'm conducting additional screening. Vance took the ID and examined it. Her face went pale. She'd seen photos of Secretary Lawson in TSA briefings, at agency meetings, in official communications. This was him, and Henley had just pulled aside the Secretary of Homeland Security for random screening based on nothing more than racial profiling. Marcus, this is Secretary Lawson. Could be fake. This is a federal credential with DHS security features. This is the Secretary. I'm following protocol. Other passengers were now openly staring. A man pulled out his phone and started recording. A woman whispered to her companion. The line behind Lawson had stopped moving. Lawson remained perfectly calm. Years of testifying before Congress, managing crises, and navigating high-pressure situations had taught him exactly how to handle this. He knew cameras were recording. He knew witnesses were watching. He knew this would become public, And he knew the best strategy was to let Henley's bias expose itself completely. Agent Henley, I'm going to make this very simple. I am Raymond Lawson, the Secretary of Homeland Security. You work for the department I oversee. This is my federal credential. You can verify it by calling TSA headquarters, by calling the DHS Operations Center, or by looking at any official communications from the past 3 years that have my photo. But you're going to do this screening anyway, aren't you? Henley's face flushed. The trap was set. If he backed down now, he'd look foolish. If he continued, he'd be proven wrong in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras. His ego made the decision. Everyone gets screened. No. Exceptions. Vance tried to intervene. Marcus, I'm ordering you to step back. I'll handle this. This is my screening. Lawson watched the interaction with the detached observation of someone who'd prosecuted hundreds of cases and knew exactly how evidence worked. Every word Henley said was being recorded. Every decision was being witnessed. The lawsuit was writing itself. Henley directed Lawson to the additional screening area, a roped-off section visible to everyone in the security line. The performance had begun. Place your briefcase on the table. Open it. Lawson complied, unlocking the briefcase and opening it to reveal file folders, a tablet, and classified documents in sealed envelopes marked with security clearances. What's in these folders? Official documents, classified briefing materials. Henley picked up one of the envelopes, examining it. I need to open these. Vance stepped forward quickly. Marcus, those are classified materials. You don't have clearance. I have authority to inspect any materials going through security. Lawson's voice remained perfectly calm. Agent Henley, those documents are classified at the top secret SCI level. Opening them without proper clearance is a federal crime. You're welcome to verify my credentials with TSA headquarters, but you cannot open those materials. Henley hesitated. Other agents were now watching. The crowd had grown. More phones were recording. A businessman in the line called out, "That's the DHS secretary. I've seen him on the news." Henley ignored the comment. He set down the envelope and began the pat-down, running his hands over Lawson's jacket, sides, and legs with unnecessary roughness. Lawson stood with his arms extended, his expression neutral, his mind cataloging every violation of protocol. What's the purpose of your travel? Meeting in Chicago? Border security conference? Why Chicago? Because that's where the conference is. The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable. A few passengers watching suppressed smiles. Henley's face reddened. Watch your tone. I'm answering your questions, Agent Henley. Henley moved to the bag search, pulling out items one by one. A phone charger, noise-canceling headphones, a protein bar, a water bottle. He examined each item as if expecting to find contraband hidden in electronics or food. The swab tests came next. Henley ran explosive residue swabs over the briefcase, the laptop, Lawson's shoes, his belt. Each test took time. Each test came back negative. Each test was filmed. Vance tried one more time. Marcus, I'm directly ordering you to stop this screening. Return Secretary Lawson's belongings. This screening is within protocol. No, it's not. You're detaining a federal official without reasonable suspicion. I have reasonable suspicion. Based on what? Henley couldn't answer. Because the truth, I have reasonable suspicion because he's black, wasn't something he could say out loud. His silence was its own answer. The entire screening lasted 14 minutes. Every second of it was filmed by at least 3 passengers. Every moment documented Henley's bias, Lawson's composure, and Vance's failed attempts to intervene. Lawson answered every question calmly. He complied with every demand. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He simply let Marcus Henley publicly humiliate the Secretary of Homeland Security based on racial profiling, while cameras captured every moment. The final swab test came back negative. The bag search found nothing. The pat-down revealed no weapons. Everything Lawson had said was true. Everything about his credentials was authentic. Henley had nothing. He finally had to let him go. You're cleared. Lawson collected his belongings, carefully repacking his briefcase. He put his shoes back on, one at a time, with deliberate slowness. He straightened his tie. He brushed lint from his jacket. And then he looked at Henley with an expression that was perfectly neutral, but carried the weight of 3 decades in law enforcement. "You'll be hearing from my office." Then he walked to his gate. The video was on Twitter within 15 minutes. By the time Lawson's flight took off, it had 50,000 views. By the time it landed in Chicago, it had 2.3 million views and was the #1 trending topic in the United States. The headlines wrote themselves. CNN, Secretary of Homeland Security detained by TSA in apparent racial profiling incident. MSNBC, cabinet member humiliated at Reagan National. The video everyone's watching. Fox News, DHS chief stopped by his own TSA agent. System failure or protocol. The Washington Post, when the man who oversees airport security can't pass through it. The New York Times, top Homeland Security official detained in airport, sparking debate on racial profiling. Civil rights organizations issued immediate statements. The NAACP called for a federal investigation. The ACLU demanded systemic reforms. The National Urban League described the incident as proof that no level of achievement protects Black Americans from bias. Legal scholars appeared on cable news to discuss the implications. Former TSA officials expressed shock. Current and former cabinet members tweeted support for Lawson. The comment sections filled with predictable divides. Some people defended Henley, claiming he was just doing his job, following protocol, treating everyone equally. The statistical evidence proved otherwise. Others pointed to the documented pattern, the 3 prior complaints, the 7 years of bias that TSA had documented and ignored. Do you think federal officials should be automatically exempt from TSA screening? Let me know in the comments. TSA Administrator David Chen received the first call at 7:18 a.m., while Lawson was still in the air. The video was everywhere. Secretary of Homeland Security detained and searched by his own TSA agent. Cabinet member racially profiled at Reagan National. DHS Secretary publicly humiliated in airport security. Chen watched the video 3 times. He saw Lawson present credentials. He saw Henley dismiss them. He saw the calm professionalism of a man who knew exactly what he was documenting. And he saw the career-ending stupidity of an agent who'd let bias override every shred of common sense. Chen called an emergency meeting. He called Lawson's chief of staff. He called the DHS Inspector General. And he called Reagan National's security director to pull Marcus Henley off the floor immediately. By 9:30 a.m., major news outlets were running the story. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, every network covering it. Homeland Security Secretary detained by TSA agent in apparent racial profiling incident. The video played on loop. Legal experts weighed in. Former TSA officials expressed shock. Civil rights organizations demanded accountability. Marcus Henley was placed on administrative leave at 10:15 a.m. His badge and credentials were confiscated. His access to TSA systems was revoked. His employment file, complete with 3 prior complaints and 3 rounds of bias training, was pulled for review. The internal investigation took 11 days. The findings were damning. Henley had selected Secretary Lawson for screening based solely on appearance. He had doubted authentic federal credentials without any reasonable suspicion. He had ignored his supervisor's direct order. He had conducted unnecessary and humiliating additional screening, despite finding no evidence of any security threat. And he had done all of this while being filmed by multiple witnesses. The investigation also revealed the pattern. 7 years of complaints. 3 prior incidents of racial profiling. Statistical analysis showing 73% of Henley's random selections were non-white passengers. Training that had been completed but never internalized. A system that had documented the problem, flagged the problem, and failed to solve the problem until it targeted someone with the power to demand accountability. Marcus Henley was terminated 18 days after the incident. The termination letter was final and devastating. Agent Henley detained the Secretary of Homeland Security without reasonable suspicion, refused to accept authentic federal credentials, and engaged in racial profiling. Despite 3 prior sustained complaints and multiple training interventions, Agent Henley continued to demonstrate discriminatory screening practices. His employment is terminated immediately, and he is permanently barred from federal employment. Henley's name was entered into every federal employment database. His security clearance was revoked. His career in law enforcement or security was over at 38 years old. Patricia Vance, the supervisor who tried to intervene, received a written reprimand for failing to physically remove Henley from the situation when he refused her order. Two other supervisors who'd signed off on prior complaint resolutions without meaningful investigation were demoted. Reagan National's TSA director was reassigned to a desk position. Administrator Chen issued a formal apology to Secretary Lawson. The Department of Homeland Security announced a comprehensive review of TSA screening practices. But Secretary Lawson wasn't satisfied with terminations and apologies. He filed a federal lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, naming Marcus Henley individually, Patricia Vance for supervisory failure, the Transportation Security Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security. The complaint was 47 pages long and devastating in its detail. The claims were extensive: violation of civil rights under 42 U.S.C., paragraph 1983, racial discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, unlawful detention and false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, violation of Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure, failure to properly train and supervise employees with documented histories of bias, negligent retention of an employee with known propensity for discrimination, and violation of federal anti-discrimination statutes. Each claim was supported by the video evidence, witness statements, Henley's documented complaint history, and statistical analysis of his screening patterns. The complaint also detailed the specific harms: professional humiliation in front of colleagues and subordinates, emotional distress from being racially profiled, reputational damage from viral videos, physical discomfort from the extended detention and screening, and the message sent to Black Americans that even the highest federal positions don't protect them from discriminatory treatment. The government's lawyers reviewed the case and reached the same conclusion the city of Seattle had reached with FBI agent Monroe: indefensible. The video was everywhere. The witnesses were credible. The documented pattern was undeniable. And the victim was the Secretary of Homeland Security, a former FBI director and federal prosecutor who understood exactly how to build an airtight case. The settlement came 6 months later. $15 million paid to Raymond Lawson. No confidentiality clause. Full admission that TSA's screening practices had failed. Agreement to implement comprehensive reforms. Marcus Henley attempted to appeal his termination. The appeal was denied. He issued a statement through his attorney claiming he'd just been following protocol. The statement was ignored. No law enforcement agency would hire him. No private security firm would touch him. His bias had destroyed his career and cost taxpayers $15 million. Should TSA agents with documented patterns of racial profiling be automatically removed from passenger contact? Drop your answer. Secretary Lawson testified at congressional hearings 3 months after the incident. His testimony was precise, controlled, and devastating. I've spent my entire career in law enforcement and national security. I've been a federal prosecutor, FBI, director, and now Secretary of Homeland Security. I've testified before grand juries, congressional committees, and foreign intelligence services. I've been vetted for the highest security clearances multiple times, and I was detained, searched, and humiliated in an airport security checkpoint because a TSA agent looked at me and saw a threat based on nothing but the color of my skin. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. I had my credentials. I identified myself clearly. My supervisor recognized me and tried to intervene. None of it mattered because Agent Henley had decided I was suspicious before I ever spoke a word. That decision wasn't based on behavior, documents, or security protocols. It was based on bias so ingrained he couldn't see past it even when holding my federal credentials in his hands. Another pause. This happens every day to Black travelers who don't have cabinet credentials, to people who don't have the resources to fight back, to people whose detentions don't make the news. They're pulled aside, searched, questioned, and humiliated because someone in a position of authority decided they look suspicious. If this can happen to the Secretary of Homeland Security with all my credentials and authority, what happens to everyone else? The committee room was silent. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for equal treatment. I'm asking for screening based on actual security concerns, not assumptions about who belongs in first class or who looks like a threat. And I'm asking why TSA kept an agent with 3 sustained complaints and statistically impossible selection patterns in direct passenger contact for 7 years until he targeted someone powerful enough to force accountability. The room remained silent. Should federal agencies face mandatory civil rights audits after patterns of discrimination are documented? Comment your thoughts. This wasn't just about one TSA agent's bad decision. This was about a system that documented bias, trained against bias, complained about bias, and then did nothing meaningful to stop it until it targeted someone too powerful to ignore. Marcus Henley had doubted Secretary Lawson's credentials, not because they looked fake, but because his bias told him black men don't hold those positions. The credentials were real. The authority was real. The violation was real. But Henley's worldview was so distorted by years of unchecked assumptions that he couldn't process evidence held in his hands. This is how systemic racism operates in institutional spaces. It's not always violent or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, bureaucratic, built on selection patterns that seem random until analyzed statistically. It's an agent who sees a black passenger and assumes they need additional screening. It's a supervisor who documents complaints but takes no action. It's a system that validates those assumptions until someone with resources and power fights back. And when that bias is backed by the authority to detain, to search, to humiliate someone in front of dozens of witnesses, it doesn't just harm individuals. It sends a message. Your credentials don't matter. Your position doesn't matter. Your rights don't matter when bias has made its decision. Marcus Henley's career is over. That's consequence. The government paid $15 million. That's accountability. TSA implemented reforms. That's progress. But settlements and terminations don't undo the humiliation of being publicly searched like a criminal. They don't erase the dozens of videos showing a cabinet member treated like a suspect. They don't eliminate the message that even being Secretary of Homeland Security isn't enough to protect you from racial profiling. The real question is, what changes now? Does TSA finally remove agents after 2 complaints instead of 7 years of documented bias? Do supervisors finally take action when statistical patterns scream discrimination? Do we finally acknowledge that random screenings that are 73% non-white aren't random at all? Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Henley screening passengers for 7 years, despite 3 prior complaints, if we don't address the training that agents attend but never internalize, then we're just waiting for the next agent, the next passenger, the next viral video, the next lawsuit. Comment if you believe this should be law. Federal employees with 3 sustained discrimination complaints are automatically removed from public contact positions pending comprehensive review. Agencies that fail to act face mandatory Justice Department oversight and financial penalties equal to settlement amounts. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with exposure and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button because we're not stopping. We're going to keep documenting these patterns. We're going to keep demanding better. We're going to keep fighting for the cabinet secretaries, the business travelers, the ordinary people who deserve to move through airports without being criminalized for their appearance. This isn't just about one agent or one secretary. It's about all of us and the systems we're willing to accept. Because the day a black man can become Secretary of Homeland Security, but still can't pass through airport security without being treated like a suspect, is the day we admit our systems value bias over credentials, assumptions over evidence, and power over justice. 3 complaints in 7 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. A pattern the system documented, flagged, and ignored until it cost $15 million and destroyed a career. How many more patterns are we ignoring right now?